Chapter 15, question 15 is asking, how does LDL differ from HDL? The last L here is standing for lipoprotein. And as we saw in Chapter 15, question 14, lipoproteins are little balls of oil, little droplets of oil here in the center that are surrounded by phospholipids whose heads are polar, and whose tails are nonpolar, and that combination allows lipids to travel through a watery medium like blood. We also noticed how these things with ApoBs or ApoEs, those are proteins that are on the surface of the lipoproteins, and they're like, if you imagine this as a sort of package that's being sent in the mail, those would be like the address and the postage that lets the cells that this lipoprotein passes by know whether to pick it up or not. Interestingly, the gene for ApoE, this protein on a lipoprotein, is the only, currently in 2019, the only genetic marker that is known to either predispose or undispose somebody to getting Alzheimer's disease. There are 4 different versions for that protein, and one of the versions predisposes you to getting Alzheimer's, and another version undisposes you from getting Alzheimer's, protects you from getting Alzheimer's. And it's the only genetic marker that people currently know for that. So it's for this protein that's on the surface of a lipoprotein that lets fat know where to go. And the reason for that is because there's a correlation between Alzheimer's and atherosclerosis, or hardening of the arteries. If plaque builds up on all the arteries in your brain, then nutrients can't get to your brain cells, and the waste products in your brain cells can't get out to your bloodstream. So the waste products build up, and they starve a little bit, and that could trigger the clumping of proteins called amyloid beta that occurs in Alzheimer's patients. So that's one association that's known, and so one significance for these. Here's a more beautiful drawing of a lipoprotein, or animation of a lipoprotein. You see here in the center the lipids, and that the molecule is carrying, and then the orange stuff are the lipoproteins in this diagram, and this big blue thing would be one of these proteins on top that are called apolipoproteins. Okay, all lipoproteins are not made the same. There are different types, and 2 really important types are HDL and LDL. They're important because these influence the extent of atherosclerosis that you're likely to get. And since cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer, and also the one disease that the United States government spends the most money on trying to cure or treat as of 2019, these are really significant in medicine. So, we know that L stands for lipoprotein. The HD and LD are referring to the density of the lipoprotein. Let's start with LDL. LDL stands for low density lipoprotein. For each of these, you want to remember 4 things. So that's the first thing, what they stand for. LDL stands for low density lipoprotein. The density is coming from the relative amount of fat versus protein. In this diagram, the protein is in blue, and the fat is sort of in this brown yellow. So you can see that a low-density lipoprotein compared to a high-density lipoprotein, or HDL, the low-density lipoprotein has more lipids and less protein. Lipids are less dense than protein, and that's why this lipoprotein has low density. Lipids, if you pour oil in water, the oil floats on the top. It's not very dense. Remember, density determines whether things sink or float. If you put protein in water, say like protein powder, it'll sink to the bottom. It's more dense. And so if you have a lot of lipids and not a lot of protein, you won't be very dense. You'll be a low density lipoprotein. So that's the second thing you'd want to know, the relative composition of lipid versus protein. Then you want to know the role of this. Low-density lipoprotein carries lipids to tissues. Now, if the tissues don't need the lipids, instead of bringing it into the cells, these low-density lipoproteins could deposit lipids on your artery walls. So low-density lipoprotein brings lipids to your tissues, but if your tissues don't need it, the low-density lipoproteins could just start depositing the lipids on your artery walls. And because of that, you'd get a sort of plaque that could build up on your artery walls. And so the more LDL you have, the more chance you have of getting a thick plaque on your artery walls. And so the more LDL you have, the higher it's associated with high levels of that LDL, increasing the risk of getting atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is an important term to know. Osis just means condition of. Scler means hard. And athero is talking about arteries. So atherosclerosis is the condition of a hardening of the arteries. If you imagine this being a cross-section of an artery, LDL will slowly deposit lipids on the walls, and the more lipids they have, the harder your arteries get, and so you get atherosclerosis. Okay, so those are the 4 things you'd want to know for LDL. You want to know the same 4 things for HDL. So HDL, first, what does it stand for? This stands for high density lipoproteins. And if you look at the diagram, you'll notice this has a lot more proteins on it relative to the low density lipoproteins. So many more proteins and less oil or fat. So this has more protein and less lipids. And that's what makes it high density. Remember that proteins sink to the bottom of water. They tend to sink to the bottom of water. They are high density. Lipids float on water. They're low density. If you have a lot of protein and not very much lipid, then you will be a high density lipoprotein. Third thing you want to know is what it does. The HDL carries lipids from tissues to the liver to be broken down and that helps prevent deposition of lipids on artery walls. And so, the 4th thing, its relationship to atherosclerosis, high levels of HDL, that decrease your risk of getting atherosclerosis. So it helps if you have high levels of HDL, the nutrients in your blood pass more easily to your tissues. The waste products from your tissues pass more easily to your blood, where they can be excreted in urine or feces, and then and also you are at less risk of having a heart attack. So HDL will help prevent your risk of getting atherosclerosis, and LDL will increase your risk of getting atherosclerosis. You can get more HDL and less LDL by doing cardiovascular exercise, so running or rowing. And you can also get more HDL and less LDL by eating unsaturated fatty acids. So things like olive oils or plant oils, or things that have those in them, like nuts or seeds.